Steve Jones was born in London in September of 1955. He lived with his mother, who worked as a hairdresser, and his grandparents. His father, who was a professional boxer, left when Steve was 2 years old. Later on in life, Steve revealed in his autobiography that he was sexually abused by his stepfather, which he believes contributed to his eventual sex addiction and inability to form lasting relationships.
Yeah, I'm sure it did.
He said, quote, "I just turned into a kleptomaniac and a sex addict. I was addicted to everything. But that's not to say it made me a drug addict or an alcoholic. I think I already had that gene. It definitely pushed me to act out further. I was trying to fix a hole inside me." End quote. So when he told his mother about the abuse, she told him that he was crazy, and he hasn't spoken with her since 2008.
So she was also high-key abused.
Probably, yeah.
Abso-freaking-lutely.
Yeah. As a teenager, Steve was really uninterested in school and started drifting into a life of petty crime. Also as a teenager, he picked up the guitar and was inspired by bands like the Stooges and the New York Dolls, which were the same bands that were inspiring the New York City punk scene. Since Steve was broke, he acquired quite a few musical instruments by stealing them from established musicians. At one point, David Bowie was playing his last show as the character Ziggy Stardust in London. Steve and his friends posed as road crew and stole some drum cymbals, a few amplifiers, and a couple of microphones from the truck that was parked outside of the venue.
Why are you just getting the cymbals? Like,
That's
I
all they needed.
I don't condone any of it, but like, what?
So Steve eventually ended up with 14 criminal convictions, and he spent a year in a remand center. But he said being in the remand center, remand, probably remand center.
Remand.
But he said,
making you into a new man.
He said that was better than being at home. In the early 1970s, Steve decided to form a band with a couple of friends, a guy named Paul Cook and Wally Nightingale, which is the best name.
That's a good name.
Wally Nightingale. That's so good. At that time, he was the singer, Paul played drums, and Wally played guitar. They named themselves The Strand, which they later changed to The Swankers. Wally left the group, so Steve grabbed a Gibson Les Paul, a guitar that he'd eventually help make iconic, and he taught himself the basics using one rule: no Beatles chords. Paul Cook was born in July 1956 in London. I honestly can't find out all that much about his childhood. He's kind of a more like private person.
Good for him.
But he started playing drums when he was a teenager, and he met Steve at secondary school, where they'd often skip class together. They hung out often and played covers of songs that they liked. One day, while skipping class, they decided to form a band together. Steve and Paul often hung out at a clothing store in West London that was called Let It Rock. The shop was based around kind of like a 1950s teddy boy themed aesthetic. So Let It Rock was founded and operated by a guy named Malcolm McLaren. Some of his designs appeared in movies like Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Oh, cool. He
started to make leather-based clothes with studs, which kind of started a bit of a craze in the early 70s.
Is he the first one to do that?
Probably not, but he probably helped popularize it. In 1973, he went to New York for work, where he met the New York Dolls. He was very inspired by their clothes and their general aesthetic, and eventually became their manager. But before Malcolm moved to New York, Steve asked him if he would manage The Strand, which, remember, was their band. Malcolm kind of half-heartedly agreed, but he did help them rent their first rehearsal space. He also connected them with an art student and sometimes Let It Rock employee named Glenn Matlock, who became the band's bassist. In 1974, Malcolm and his business partner rebranded their shop to capitalize on a different trend that they saw happening. They started getting a bunch of fetish-inspired stuff and billed themselves as, quote, specialist in rubberware, glamourware, and stagewear.
Hell yeah.
They renamed their shop Sex. Just all capital letters, too.
Honestly, I love the audacity of this guy. I'm
Hold on to that feeling, because you're not going to like him by the end of this episode.
Damn it. I mean, generally, men with audacity is 50-50.
After his stint in New York, Malcolm became super interested in the punk scene, particularly the Ramones and television. When he moved back to London, Malcolm took a new interest in that little band called The Strand that used to hang around his shop. Malcolm knew that the band still needed a frontman. Malcolm tried to recruit a member of the New York Dolls to come and front the band, but those plans fell through, so they started to look for a singer locally. According to Glenn, who was the bassist, everyone had long hair back then, So they just stopped anyone that they saw with short hair and asked if they considered themselves a singer. And that was how they started to get auditions.
That's hilarious.
Just trying to get anyone going against the mold. That's when someone saw a young kid who sometimes hung around the shop wearing a Pink Floyd t-shirt. But he had written, "I hate" at the top. So it said, "I hate Pink Floyd." And he cut the eyes out of the picture that was on it.
Oh my God. What?
Yep. Malcolm asked the kid to come meet Steve and Paul at a local pub. Steve said about that meeting, quote, "He came in with green hair. I thought he had a really interesting face. I liked his look."
So he's ugly.
Yeah. "I liked his look. He had this 'I hate Pink Floyd' t-shirt on, and it was held together with safety pins. John had something special, but when he started talking, he was a real asshole, but smart." End quote.
Oh, no.
They conducted an impromptu audition that featured John singing over Alice Cooper that they played on the jukebox. And after that, he was asked to join the band. Apparently, the guys in the band, which I think at this point is Glenn, Steve, and Paul, all laughed at his audition since John had no musical background, but Malcolm convinced them to let him into the band. Steve gave him the nickname Johnny Rotten because his teeth were so bad. Steve said, quote, "A couple of them in the front looked green. They just looked rotten. They weren't fangs or nothing. It was no biggie, but I guess it stuck." End quote. John Lydon was born in London in January of 1956. His parents were working class and immigrated from Ireland. He was pretty poor. His family had to share an outside toilet with the general public. At age 7, he contracted spinal meningitis. So spinal meningitis put him in and out of comas for almost a year and affected his eyesight and damaged most of his early memories.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. When he returned to school, he was very shy and got bullied quite a bit.
Oh my gosh.
His mother was often sick and his dad was often away on job sites, so John had to take care of his 3 younger brothers. He got his first job at age 10 working as a taxi dispatcher. As a teenager, he started to find some refuge in music, listening to bands that his mother hated, like Alice Cooper, the Stooges, and David Bowie. He attended a secondary school where he was at first bullied, but eventually started to fight back. He started to, quote, break out of the mold. He claims he was expelled for, quote, daring to question teachers and refusing to toe the line, end quote. Johnny exaggerates, so may not be completely accurate, but also at the time, you could get expelled quite easily. Like, apparently, a teacher demanded that he cut his long hair, so he did, but also dyed it green. And that's, like, one of the things that he was pushing back against authority, so he got expelled. It was around that...
She didn't say, "Don't dye your hair green."
This
is the first and last time I'm defending this child, but...
It was around the time that he got expelled, that he was invited to join the fledgling band that Malcolm was managing. Johnny described the state of Britain in the mid-70s that kind of inspired a lot of what the Sex Pistols did. He said, quote, "Early 70s Britain was a very depressing place. It was completely run down. There was trash on the streets, total unemployment. Just about everybody was on strike. Everybody was brought up with an education system that told you point blank that if you came from the wrong side of the tracks, then you had no hope in hell and no career prospects at all. Out of that came pretentious me and the Sex Pistols, and then a whole bunch of copycat wankers after us."
Oh my God.
Quote. Around this time, the band decided on a name. They decided on the Sex Pistols, which was a modified version of a name that they had been informally going by. They started to write their own songs, usually with Glenn Matlock, who we haven't really talked about, but he's kind of like, he's the bassist. He was a big deal in the early band. Glenn was writing the melodies, and Johnny was writing the lyrics. Their first collaboration, which was a song called Pretty Vacant, was almost solely written by Glenn, but Johnny tweaked the lyrics a bit.
And got writing credits.
Well, credit was shared equally amongst the 4 of them, which is nice. That's a nice touch. Glenn also arranged their first gig, which was at his art college. They played the gig on November 6, 1975, in support of a pub rock group called Bazooka Joe.
That's a good name.
Yeah. Opening for them at Glenn's art college was the first ever Sex Pistols show. Bazooka Joe agreed to let the Pistols use their instruments, since the Pistols didn't have any of their own stuff.
Oh, no.
The Pistols started by playing some cover songs, and the people there said they were musically unimpressive, aside from being very loud. Before the Pistols could start playing some of the music that they had written, Bazooka Joe pulled the plug on their performance, which they did because the Pistols were trashing Bazooka Joe's equipment. And that resulted in a brief fight between the two bands on stage. The Pistols played more shows at clubs and colleges and started to attract a following, mostly by word of mouth. They still hadn't officially released any music or any recordings at all, but Malcolm had larger ideas for the group than just musical success. Malcolm was a huge fan of something called the Situationist movement, which was a kind of strange group of revolutionaries in Europe made up of mostly avant-garde artists. They were basically Marxist in their thinking and heavily critiqued capitalism. And this all culminated in 1968 in Paris, where Situationists led an uprising that led to weeks of civil unrest and strikes throughout the city.
Originally, I heard about the Situationists when I was at art school, looking for a cause. We basically looked to do something that would make ourselves feel like we could be gigantic posers, show-offs. And we tried in our own way to pay homage by ransacking and sitting in and taking over our own art schools. It didn't last long, and it led us ultimately to care about trying to create a lifestyle which we in turn could turn the tables. We in turn could do things that would shift the intelligence.
Kind of a large part of the Situationist movement was the idea of, I guess I would call it like performance art, like spectacle, like creating something that like catches people's attention. Like, have you seen the thing where people are randomly going to museums and throwing soup on famous paintings?
Yes.
That's a similar idea. Like, it's just kind of like this absurd performance art thing that catches people's attention. And since they were all avant-garde artists, they were trying to do that to like inspire this anti-capitalism trend kind of thing.
Okay.
He saw the Pistols as a way to push that kind of anti-government, anti-establishment message to an audience who wouldn't otherwise hear about it. He started to teach Johnny about these different ideas. Some of Malcolm's friends, who also believed in the idea of social revolution, started to work on publicity for the group. So, before the Sex Pistols even put out a song, they were pretty well known in the press. By 1976, they were starting to really get attention, and Johnny Rotten was pushing the boundaries of performance as far as they would go. He would walk off stage, sit with the audience, throw chairs around, and smash the equipment of the headliners. In an interview, Steve said, quote, "Actually, we're not into music, we're into chaos," end quote.
I think you're trying to shock people.
I don't give a shit what you think. I know what I think, and that's all that counts to me. I don't try and impress anybody but myself.
Why all the fuss then? Why dress up? Why
Dress up
famous
for
language?
what? Dress up what?
Dye your hair?
So what? Am I not entitled to do what I want with my own body? I think I am. That's all that counts.
Why do we
Being
think...
left alone. Just leave me alone, you know what I mean?
Soon, they were playing in more prominent clubs before getting banned from basically all of them for starting fights. They claimed that the audience was ready to fight, and they just provided the spark.
I mean,
Probably
yeah.
true, but you can't do that. So.
Well, there's a blacklist
No, you
going
can't
around.
lose that way.
Our name's the top of the blacklist. As soon as any promoter puts you on and they use the Sex Pistols, they take away the license for a day.
In April of 1976, the Ramones released their debut album and changed the punk scene. It's hard to overstate the importance of that record, but Johnny still says it did not influence the Pistols at all. He said, quote, "The Ramones were all long-haired and of no interest to me."
right, because they had long hair, therefore they were mainstream, and you were an agent of chaos.
They didn't. Dee Dee didn't have long hair, but whatever. I didn't like their image, what they stood for, or anything about them, end quote.
I didn't not like the New York punk scene, but a lot of people, these magazines that were in New York, the people from the outside who ain't actually in the band, come up with the punk started here, it's the Ramones, it's blah, 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 blah. I mean, we were actually playing before I ever heard the Ramones album.
That's right.
And I like the Ramones. I've got no problem with the Ramones.
In May, they first started trying to record some demos, and around this time, other punk groups who saw the Pistols as the future of music started to form and were opening for them. The Pistols were signed to a 2-year contract with EMI in October. In November of 1976, the Sex Pistols released their first single called Anarchy in the UK. Although it wasn't the first punk song that was released in the UK, other bands had gotten there first, it was the first one that tied this new punk movement to political ideas.
Okay.
In December of 1976, they appeared on a morning show called Today.
Honestly, like, what? That's so funny that they would go on, like, a main street, like a morning talk show.
Yeah, and it ended about how you would expect. They were booked last minute when fellow EMI artist Queen had to drop out because of Freddie Mercury's dental appointment. So that interviewer is a guy named Grundy, and he was a well-known alcoholic, so he was also very drunk during that interview.
Honestly, I liked him.
Egging them on to
I
be
liked
outrageous.
him. He kind of kept his chill.
Yeah. So that incident on live television changed their future. They became heroes in the underground scene and hated by the media.
Literally, but like for what? They have nothing to say there. They're just like, I
think
hate
it's
you.
the idea that they went on to national television and cussed.
Go on, you've got another 5 seconds. Say something outrageous.
You dirty bastard.
Go on, again.
You dirty fucker.
What a clever boy.
What a fucking rotter.
Well, that's it for tonight. I'll be seeing you soon. I hope I'm not seeing you again. From me, though, good night.
So after this, they had national media attention. All of it negative, but that suited them just fine. Steve later said about that incident, quote, "Grundy was the big dividing line in the Sex Pistols story. Before it, we were all about the music, but from then on, it was all about the media. In some ways, it was our finest moment, but in others, it was the beginning of the end. In terms of the Sex Pistols having any kind of long-term future, this sudden acceleration was the worst thing that could possibly happen.
Oh.
I still think we'd have got..." This is still the Steve quote, by the way.
Okay.
"I still think we'd have got really big in the end without it, but the whole process would have been much slower and maybe less dramatic. I guess it was never our destiny to be a normal band who made a few albums and then fade away."
Did he say traumatic or dramatic?
Traumatic.
Oh, God.
Grundy was defined... Grundy was definitely the point where everybody's egos started to spin out. McLaren's probably the worst of all. That's the end of the quote. In January of 1977, they were dropped by EMI. Then, in February of 1977, word leaked that Glenn was leaving the Sex Pistols. At first, it was stated that he was being kicked out because he liked the Beatles. Really, he was kicked out because he wasn't punk enough.
Which is
the same
in their eyes.
Despite writing most of the songs on their upcoming album, he was replaced by someone that Johnny knew from school. Although he couldn't play bass at all, he looked like a punk, so he was brought in and quickly became a punk poster boy. Simon Ritchie was born in 1957 in London. His father was a semi-professional trombone player in the London jazz scene, as well as a guard at Buckingham Palace. Soon after he was born, Simon and his mother moved to Ibiza, where his father never showed up there and never provided them any financial support. So his mother, when they were in Ibiza, started to use drugs and kind of just completely forgot about him. When they returned to England, he started to hang out in the streets of London and fell in love with the pre-punk musicians that everyone else liked, like the New York Dolls, the Stooges, that whole kind of scene. In 1975, at school, he met Johnny Rotten, who nicknamed him Sid Vicious after a hamster that had bit his father's hand. Apparently, Sid hated the name, but it stuck.
And he's known by that forevermore?
Yes. John and Sid would sleep in vacant buildings and sometimes busk for money. When Johnny joined the Sex Pistols, Sid became one of their most visible followers. They had a group that always followed them around called the Bromley Contingent. Sid was known for his often violent conduct at shows. When Glenn was kicked out of the band, Sid took his place as bassist.
I went down there and he said, "Do you want to play bass for the Sex Pistols?" All I did was cash in on the fact that I'm good looking and I have a good figure and girls like me.
I don't think anyone really knows the actual reason that Glenn left the Pistols. He claims he chose to leave because he was sick of just kind of like the whole circus of it. Everyone generally agrees that there was tension between him and Johnny Rotten, but like, who doesn't Johnny have tension with?
Right.
They claim Malcolm encouraged that tension as a creative mechanism.
Honestly, like, good for Glenn for getting out of there.
Yeah, for real.
I hope that he had a long, fulfilling, healthy life.
Eventually, Steve would admit that it was a mistake that Glenn left and they would have been around much longer if he'd stayed.
It was too much too soon at a really young age, and we were like a kind of a railway track, all of us kind of going like that. And the big collision was where all the songs happened and the furore happened and the sound, but everybody just spun off in their own different ways.
But now we're in the era of Sid Vicious and the Sex Pistols. Sid kind of split the band in two. On one side was Paul and Steve, who thought that Sid was crazy, and on the other side was Sid and Johnny, who thrived in that chaos. Behind it all, we have Malcolm, who's kind of just pulling strings and encouraging that tension and aggression. With the exit of Glenn, Malcolm was basically able to form the Pistols into whatever he wanted them to be. So for Malcolm, it wasn't about the music. It never was. It was an image thing. Sid was just a little Johnny, and Johnny was completely bought into the whole Malcolm ideology. At this point, according to Steve, the Pistols became basically a comic strip. It was about sensationalism and scandal. The Pistols also had a very negative impact on Sid. Sure, he was a little bit crazy beforehand, but according to the others in the band, it was like a childlike craziness, all giggly and unserious.
Yeah.
Never mind that he blinded a girl when he threw a beer bottle at the stage that shattered, and he once beat a music reporter with a metal pipe.
Okay, yeah, just little boys doing little boy things.
When he became a Pistol, he was all of a sudden a pop star with attention, adoration, and exposure. Early in 1977, Sid met Nancy Spungen, who was an emotionally fragile drug addict and sometimes prostitute from New York. Nancy left home at 17, moved to New York, and supported herself as a part-time music journalist and clothing store employee.
Go, Nancy.
But really, she was a groupie.
Go, little rock star.
She followed bands like Aerosmith and the Ramones before flying to London with the Heartbreakers and soon met Sid. They fell in love, much to the annoyance of the other Pistols. It's widely assumed that Nancy introduced Sid to heroin, and their emotional codependency alienated them from the rest of the group. Johnny later said, quote, "We did everything to get rid of Nancy. She was killing him. I was absolutely convinced this girl was on a slow suicide mission. Only she didn't want to go alone. She wanted to take Sid with her. She was evil." End quote.
He didn't like me because I was a junkie. He tried to keep me and Sid apart for months and months and months. Like, we had to keep the clandestine secret, everything. And finally he just gave up because he couldn't do it. He just couldn't do it. Sid just kept saying, "Look, I will hang around with who I want to hang around with."
In March, the Pistols signed to A&M Records, and then they promptly went to the A&M offices, where Sid smashed a toilet, cutting his foot, and tracked blood around the office.
What?
While Johnny verbally abused the staff, and Steve hooked up with a girl in the bathroom. Later, at a concert, they got into a fight with another band, and one of Johnny's friends threatened the life of a good friend of A&M's director. So the label dropped them and destroyed the already pressed copies of their next single. So then they signed with Virgin Records, their third label in 9 months.
That's ironic.
Virgin tried to release the second single, but workers at the pressing plant went on strike in protest of the song's content. The record was finally released in June of 1977, coinciding with the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Queen's Ascension. Johnny called the song his new national anthem. The backlash was immediate. It was banned by record stores and radio stations, making it the most heavily censored song in England's history. And all of that just made the Pistols very happy. Johnny called them the only honest band in history, while Steve just pretended that they weren't a political band. All of this culminated in the Sex Pistols' first album called Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, which was released in October of 1977. The group had 3 top 10 singles, and the album eventually reached number 1 in November. Despite that success, the Pistols found it hard to play in the UK. Sid's declining drug habit, or I guess accelerating drug habit, gave them a bad reputation, and they were banned from playing many different places. In January of 1978, they embarked on their first U.S. tour that would prove to be disastrous. By this point, Sid was heavily addicted to drugs. Most of the tour was scheduled to be played in the South, and Malcolm admitted to booking redneck bars to provoke hostile situations. Sid went completely off the rails. At various times, he spit blood at a woman who rushed the stage and punched him.
Oh my God.
He called the audience a homophobic slur. He got into a fight with his own bodyguards, and he hit a fan in the head with his bass. When he was beaten up for trying to find drugs in Memphis, he wrote, quote, "Give me a fix" on his chest. But the jury is still out on whether or not he wrote it or carved it into his skin. Steve said this about why the U.S. tour was so disastrous, quote, "Just everything. It was Sid just being an idiot, just wanting to get high and not trying to play bass. It was John we just was all drifting in different directions. We weren't a band, like a unit. It was all over the place, and America just made it worse because we weren't used to this big country and all of the attention. It was just a weird time, and just in 2 weeks, however long we were in the States." End quote. By this point, Steve and Paul couldn't stand being around Johnny, who had arguably the biggest ego in music history. So Johnny was isolated, since he was also disgusted with Sid's actions. The final stop on the tour was at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco. For their encore, they played one song, which was a cover of a Stooges song. At the end of the song, Johnny said,
"Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Good night."
And just like that, the band was done.
Really?
Yep, that was the last time they were ever the Sex Pistols. Johnny left the band and announced it later while he was in New York. Steve, Paul, and Sid never performed together without Johnny, and Steve said it wouldn't have been the Sex Pistols if they decided to continue with a different singer. Johnny went on to form another band called Public Image Limited, known as PIL, which wasn't like the Sex Pistols and frustrated some of his fans, but Johnny didn't care. He also started a legal battle with Malcolm, who wouldn't let him use the name Johnny Rotten. They had a top 10 hit, Pill did, with their debut single called Public Image. Along with working on PIL, Johnny has written an autobiography and released some solo stuff. Johnny has been married to a German publishing heiress since the late 70s. In 2020, he announced that he had become her full-time caregiver since she had been suffering from Alzheimer's. For a bit after the breakup, Paul Cook and Steve Jones worked together on a film soundtrack in Brazil. Then they started a new band called The Professionals, but the group was beset by troubles from the start and, after Steve's drug problems, called it quits in the early 80s. Paul has popped up from time to time as producer or as a session drummer, but he hasn't really been super involved in public life since his Sex Pistols days. He is still friends with Steve, and Steve gave him his blessing to reform the Professionals without him in 2015. So Paul is still out there touring with the Professionals, and he lives in West London with his wife, Jenny Cook, who is in a new wave band called Culture Club. Steve Jones, after the Professionals, played as a guitarist on several recordings and tried to launch a bit of a solo career. He also hosted a daily radio program in LA called Jonesy's Jukebox. After a 10-plus year addiction to drugs, he was able to get sober in 1990, and he remains sober.
Shut up.
Yeah.
Oh my
Pretty
gosh.
Great. After he left the Sex Pistols, Glenn Matlock formed a new wave group called Rich Kids. He also briefly played in a band called Vicious White Kids, with Sid Vicious as the singer.
We did it for a laugh more than anything else. Sid lived round the corner from me. The Pistols thing had broken up, not only for me, but also for him and the other guys at that time. And we were sitting next to each other in my local pub. And Sid said, people seem to think we're enemies, but here we are sitting together. What can we do about it? I said, I don't know. I said, I know. Why don't we try and do a gig together just for a laugh? And he went, well, that's a good idea. Who's going to play? He said, the thing is, you're a bass player and I'm a bass player. I went, well, put it this way, Sid, I'm not going to sing. He went, well, who's going to sing then? And I said, well, how about you sing and I play bass? And he went, oh, all right, then I get it.
He played in a few other bands and played bass on an Iggy Pop album. He has since formed and reformed several different bands, and most recently, he's played bass for Blondie's 2022 UK and US tour. After the Sex Pistols, Malcolm McLaren started to make his own music. He tried a ton of different genres, including hip-hop, Latin, disco, and pop.
Excuse me, Latin?
That got you and not hip-hop? Other than his own music, he continued to produce for bands. He also turned to film production and was a part of a group that created Fashion Beast, a story that blended Beauty and the Beast with the life of Christian Dior. He also ran for mayor of London once.
What?
Talking about his career and legacy, he said, quote, I have been called many things. A charlatan, a con man, or most flatteringly, the culprit responsible for turning British popular culture into nothing more than a cheap marketing gimmick. End quote.
Yeah, uh-huh.
I think it was already that before. He passed away in 2010 of mesothelioma.
I didn't know anyone actually died from that. I thought it was just a commercial.
On October 11th, 1978, Sid and Nancy hosted a party at their New York hotel room. Sid took about 30 pills, and was basically comatose the rest of the night as people came and went. At 11 the next morning, Nancy was found dead in the bathroom with a knife wound to her stomach, and Sid was found wandering the hotel hallways. He first said that he killed her, and then said that he remembered nothing. The murder weapon was determined to be a knife that Nancy had bought for Sid a few days earlier. Sid was arrested and gave conflicting reports saying that he stabbed her but never meant to kill her, that he didn't remember anything, and that she fell on the knife. Malcolm got Virgin Records to pay for all of the legal fees and always believed that Sid was innocent. His theory is that Nancy caught someone stealing money from their drawer that was always open, and that person stabbed her using a knife, like using Sid's knife that was just nearby. There are a lot of people who might not go with that theory, but who think Sid was innocent because he had taken so many pills and was comatose, so it seems strange that he would suddenly wake up, stab his girlfriend, and then pass back out. I don't know.
Oh, man.
I don't think anyone will ever really know what happened that night. So after that incident, kind of understandably, Sid turned pretty dark and suffered from extreme depressive episodes.
Turned?
Even more so.
Nancy always said she'd die before she was 21.
Are you having fun at the moment?
Are you kidding? Oh, I'm not having fun at all.
Where would you like to be?
Under the ground.
In December of 1978, he was again arrested and charged with assault when he stabbed someone in the face with a broken beer bottle. He was taken to Rikers Island for a detoxification program. He completed that on February 1st, 1979, and left Rikers Island, where he promptly bumped into a friend and asked for heroin.
Yeah.
Which the friend found for him. And Sid died later that night of a drug overdose.
Yeah.
In recent years, the Sex Pistols have reunited on and off for like kind of one-off tours with Glenn as the bassist. During their brief history, they were regarded as one of the most groundbreaking acts in the history of popular music. They were massively influential. One early show in Manchester, attended by roughly 40 people, was attended by people who were so influenced by that show that they went on to become successful artists. Members of the band Joy Division, The Smiths, and the Buzzcocks were all present that night. Pete Townsend of The Who summed them up this way, quote, "When you listen to the Sex Pistols, to Anarchy in the UK and Bodies and tracks like that, what immediately strikes you is that this is actually happening. This is a bloke with a brain on his shoulders who is actually saying something he sincerely believes is happening in the world, saying it with real venom and real passion. It touches you and it scares you. It makes you feel uncomfortable. It's like somebody saying, the Germans are coming and there's no way we're going to stop them." End quote. So that's the Sex Pistols.